Hello, 7th graders. We're going to work on finishing up our fifth and final world religion, and that is Buddhism. Buddhism is very interesting in that it came out of Hinduism, one of the religions we talked about recently. So kind of jumping into kind of the overall statistics of Buddhism, we call followers Buddhists, and they make up 376 million people around the world. That's only about 5.52% of the population of the world. Mostly a religion you're going to find in Southeast Asia. I would say, though, that here in Bloomington, Indiana, there is probably a fairly large Buddhist population. There are 2 Buddhist monasteries located in Bloomington, and just seems to be a higher concentration of Buddhist practices there. I know the Dalai Lama's brother resides in Bloomington, so kind of an interesting tie to the area that surrounds you. Who was Buddha and what is Buddhism? So historians estimate that a man named Siddhartha Gautama lived around 500 to 300 BCE. That's kind of when he was thought to have lived. He was a man of privilege. He was a prince born to a very wealthy family, and he just became kind of discontent because all that stuff was not really bringing him happiness. So he left that wealth and he began this search for understanding. And if I remember the story correctly, he kind of went to a variety of places and spoke with a variety of wise teachers and still was kind of not really finding the answers that he was searching for. He came convinced that suffering lay at the end of all existence, and that really sounds like a negative view. But solving this whole problem of suffering was kind of the key for Gautama, and what really needed to release him from this cycle in life of of suffering. So he, in response to suffering, he gave up all of his wealth and he became a monk. And during a 6-day continuous meditation in India, that's where he was from, under a tree that his followers still identify to this day as the area where this happened, he experienced this realization of how to end suffering. And that really came about in the Four Noble Truths. And at this point, he became known as the Buddha. And Buddha means enlightened one. And there's a video here that you could access through what I've uploaded. So Buddhism eventually began to spread after this time. There's an important guy mentioned in the previous slide, maybe I should go back there, named Ashoka. And he did a lot to kind of help Buddhism expand. The reason today that we see a larger percentage of Buddhists in Southeast Asia and not in India, where it was originally started, was the result of Ashoka, and he was a ruler that kind of allowed missionaries to go out and spread Buddhist teachings, and so that's why we find it so much in Southeast Asia today. Buddhists, in a lot of ways, I'm going to kind of focus on this main part down here. The upper part does kind of focus on being a polytheistic religion, and I think Buddhists, I'd say to most Buddhist followers, it is more of a philosophy, not so much a religion where there is a focus on a certain deity or a certain set of deities that are really worshipped. It more is about what each individual person can do for themselves, what they need to focus on in their life to really achieve what Buddha was able to achieve. So these Four Noble Truths all deal around suffering, and that suffering is, life is full of suffering, and our suffering is caused because we all have desires of all kinds, desires for possessions, but desires for things that are not possessions either, desires to be better looking, desires to be smarter, desire to be a better athlete, things that necessarily you can't go buy in a store. We all have those desires, and to Buddha, freeing yourself from those desires was the key. So how do we do this? The key to doing that was something he established called the Eightfold Path. And these are just really all about right living, things that probably Christians, Jews, Muslims would all accept as well. Right speech, right conduct, making good decisions, really being in touch with your consciousness, the right mindfulness of decisions that you're making, that you understand your own desires and how that can play a factor into the things that you want to have happen. Think about jealousy. When we're jealous of somebody else, how does that make us treat that person? Probably with anger, disdain. We're not kind to that person. And I think that's kind of the big teachings of Buddha it's all about you must treat people in a right way with right actions, because you have a true understanding of yourself. And so knowing oneself is key, and that often comes through the eighth path, which is meditation. Buddhists do believe in reincarnation, just like Hindus. And they believe that there's this cycle of samsara that repeats over and over again after you die. It is not a good thing. I kind of mentioned that with Hindus as well. They don't believe that this is, like another life, that, hey, it's great that you keep living life after life after life. You want the cycle to end. Now, this is often referred to in Hinduism as moksha. What all Buddhists are trying to attain is something called nirvana, the release from the cycle of rebirth. And it's kind of like when you realizing and achieving emptiness, that you have released yourself from all desire, and you kind of have this understanding and almost perfect contentment with life, that you desire really nothing. And that's kind of a lot of what Buddhism centers upon. This is a map that shows you a couple of different main schools of Buddhism. The Dalai Lama is a part of one of these two schools of following, and I don't know all the ins and outs exactly how they're different, but just recognize that all Buddhists are exactly the same. One other thing I would say about Buddha is that we often show Buddha as this kind of like jolly fat man with a big smile on his face. And I looked this up the other day because I was a little concerned and I didn't really know if that was completely true. Like, I always felt like that was like the American version of Buddha. That is something called, I think it's pronounced Bodhi. It's actually a Japanese kind of deity. And he was a Buddhist monk as well, but it's not the traditional Buddhism. That's often called the Laughing Buddha. The Laughing Buddha, if you see it maybe in like a Chinese restaurant or somewhere online, those are not really referencing the statues that are representing Siddhartha Gautama. Those statues look a little bit different. Typically, Buddha is not shown as he's usually shown in this prayer posture, almost like a meditation, legs crossed. You might see the third eye, the dot in the middle of the head, which is something used by Hindus as well. But the Laughing Buddha and the Buddha that kind of is the founder of Buddhism are two different things, even though the Laughing Buddha is based on a real person who was a Buddhist follower. So just kind of a distinction there for you. Buddhists do have temples that they worship in. You can go to the one in Bloomington. It's really interesting too. Buddhists kind of believe that you might be able to use other religions as a way to achieve Buddhist principles. I know whenever I went to the Buddhist monastery here in Bloomington, they had pictures of Jesus and they had other representations of other religions, because they would believe that following the teachings of Christ or following the teachings of other religions can lead you to enlightenment. It's not that there's just only one path. Remember, it's called the Eightfold Path, so there's multiple ways to achieve nirvana. If you're living out those Eightfold Path and you're in touch with this idea of suffering, it really could be even accomplished through just a philosophy, or it can be accomplished through a religion. So they would believe those things, but it is related to, there are mantras and prayers that they say. You might even see Buddhists carrying prayer beads. Some very strong ties to Buddhism. Here's another video about Buddhist temples. And then there are some Buddhist kind of recognized holidays. We don't really seem to focus on those too much. This is kind of that traditional statue of Buddha. And remember, they don't worship Buddha. They're trying to attain the same status of Buddha. What Buddha was able to achieve in his lifetime of attaining enlightenment, of achieving nirvana, that's the goal of all Buddhists. Which really does make it's not the worship of a deity so much, but more the philosophy of how you live. And so that's why we lump it in with religions, but in many ways, you really wouldn't classify it as a religion. So hopefully you learned something with this as we wrap up religions in this unit, and I will see you next time. Thanks.